They told me not to go there, warned me about the old Whitlock Sanitarium sitting on the edge of town, crumbling under decades of neglect, its jagged silhouette a warning etched against the night sky. Yet here I was, flashlight trembling in my grip, the decaying iron gate screeching as I forced it open, the wind carrying an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. My curiosity, no, my obsession, drove me. The stories of screams heard at midnight, of figures glimpsed in shattered windows, were too compelling to ignore. As I stepped inside, the air grew heavier, each creak of the rotting floorboards beneath my boots echoing unervingly in the vast, suffocating silence. Graffiti stained the cracked walls. Desperate words like, "Get out," and "Don't look back," clawed into the peeling paint, as if written by those who'd barely escaped. The faintest sound, a soft murmuring, tickled the edge of my hearing, but every time I swung the flashlight around, there was nothing. Only shadows growing unnaturally long, curling into shapes that seemed to move. Deeper I ventured, passing rooms with rusted gurneys and chains hanging from the ceiling, the air stinking of mildew and something older, something rotten. My breath quickened when I found a stairwell descending into the basement. The whispers became louder, fragmented voices pleading and mocking, rising and falling like a symphony of despair. Against my better judgment, I descended, the steps sagging and groaning under my weight, until I found myself in a cavernous room illuminated only by my flickering beam. The floor was scattered with papers, brittle with age, scrawled with incomprehensible symbols that seemed to writhe when I looked too long. In the center was an operating table, restraints still fastened, and around it, figures, shadowy, humanoid, and utterly still, their heads tilted toward me as though I'd interrupted something unspeakable. My heart thundered as the flashlight died, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt alive. And then the whispers surged, deafening now, an incoherent cacophony of rage and sorrow. Hands, I swear they were hands, grabbed at me from the void, cold and skeletal, dragging me back as I screamed, my voice joining the hellish chorus. My last coherent thought before everything went black was that I had been warned, and now I was part of the sanitarium's legend, another soul forever trapped in its cursed halls, my whispers joining theirs for the next foolhardy visitor to hear. It began with a dare, like all bad decisions do, a drunken challenge to spend one night in Blackthorn Manor, a crumbling estate perched at the edge of the forest where even the birds refused to sing. Stories about the place were endless. A family torn apart by madness, disappearances, and unspeakable acts, whispers of rituals, blood, and shadowy figures seen in the windows long after the manor was abandoned. But I had something to prove, both to myself and to the jeering friends who watched me cross the threshold. The broken gate creaking as if to welcome me into a realm that belonged to something other than the living. The front doors were massive, oak swollen with time and decay, and they groaned loudly as I pushed them open, revealing a grand foyer cloaked in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. The once opulent chandelier above me hanging at a precarious angle, its crystals trembling slightly though no breeze stirred. My flashlight carved out narrow beams of light, revealing cracked marble floors, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes gleamed with unnatural sharpness, and a staircase spiraling into darkness. Every step I took was accompanied by a dissonant echo that didn't quite match my pace, as if someone or something was trailing just a breath behind. The air inside was heavy, metallic, laced with a faint coppery tang that made my stomach churn, and faint scratching noises came from the walls, too rhythmic to be rats. Determined not to let fear take hold, I moved deeper into the house, passing through a series of rooms that seemed to shift as I turned away, their furniture rearranged, doors that had been open now closed, and mirrors that reflected something more than just my own image. In the dining room, a long table stretched impossibly far, its surface littered with rotted food that seemed freshly decayed, and at its head sat a chair that rocked slightly, as though someone had just left it. When I stepped closer, my flashlight flickered, and the seat was suddenly occupied by a figure shrouded in darkness, its head slowly turning toward me, though I couldn't make out its face. I bolted, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I found myself back in the foyer, but the doors I had entered through were gone, replaced by an ornate mirror that reflected a version of the manor in pristine condition. Chandeliers blazing with light, a grand piano playing a ghostly melody in the background. I heard laughter, faint but growing louder, and turned to see shadows pooling on the walls, moving independently of any light source, forming grotesque shapes that crawled toward me like living things. Panicked, I took the stairs 2 at a time, only to find the upper levels an endless maze of corridors, the wallpaper peeling to reveal flesh-like material that pulsed and bled when I touched it. Doors slammed behind me, locking me into an ever-shrinking path that led to a single room at the end of the hall. A child's bedroom, eerily untouched by time, the bed neatly made, toys arranged in perfect rows, and a music box playing a haunting lullaby. On the bed sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its eyes following me as I stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind me. The scratching noises grew louder, coming from inside the walls now, and then the whispers began. A chorus of voices, young and old, angry and pleading, all saying the same thing. "You shouldn't have come." The doll moved, its tiny hand pointing to the closet, the door creaking open to reveal a void of absolute darkness from which a figure emerged, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head brushing the ceiling as it reached for me with fingers that ended in jagged points. I screamed, throwing myself against the door, which finally gave way, sending me tumbling down the staircase that no longer ended in the foyer but instead plunged into a cavernous pit filled with writhing shadows and the faint outlines of faces, mouths open in silent screams. Falling endlessly, I heard the voices again, this time laughing, as the darkness swallowed me. The last thing I saw being the faint glimmer of the manor's windows above, glowing like hungry eyes, waiting for the next fool to cross its threshold and join the shadows beneath Blackthorn Manor. They said Hollowmore Lighthouse was a place where the ocean swallowed time itself, and yet, drawn by an inexplicable pull, I found myself trekking across the jagged cliffs under a heavy, moonless sky. The lighthouse loomed ahead like a skeletal finger, its beacon long extinguished, its surface pockmarked by centuries of storms and salt. Local legends painted it as cursed, its keepers disappearing one after the other, leaving behind only the cryptic phrase etched into the stone at the entrance. "The light keeps what it takes." My flashlight pierced the heavy fog as I pushed the rotting door open, the hinges groaning like a dying beast, revealing a spiral staircase that coiled upward into endless darkness. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of brine and decay, and as I ascended, my footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing back in distorted tones as if someone, or something, was mimicking me. The walls were adorned with faded nautical maps and photographs of long-dead keepers, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. The higher I climbed, the more the lighthouse seemed to warp, the staircase twisting at impossible angles, the steps groaning under my weight as if they might collapse at any moment. When I reached the keeper's quarters, I found a room frozen in disarray, a table set with uneaten meals now turned to mold, a chair overturned as if someone had fled, and a journal open to the last, scrawled entry. "The light whispers, calls to me, I cannot resist." Before I could process the words, I heard it. A faint hum, low and mournful, rising from the base of the tower, growing louder with each passing second. I turned to leave, but the staircase was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone, trapping me in the room that now seemed smaller, the shadows creeping closer as the hum transformed into a chorus of overlapping voices, pleading, weeping, laughing in tones that scraped against my sanity. Desperate, I forced open a rusted trapdoor leading downward, only to find a hidden chamber. A cavernous space lit by a pale, otherworldly glow emanating from a cracked, ancient lens at the center. The room was filled with the remnants of those who had come before. Tattered uniforms, shattered lanterns, and skeletal remains frozen mid-reach toward the light. Drawn by an unnatural compulsion, I approached the lens, its fractured surface pulsating as if alive, and when I touched it, the world dissolved around me. I was no longer in the lighthouse but submerged in a vast, endless ocean of darkness, surrounded by ethereal shapes that swam just beyond my vision, their whispers merging into a single, chilling command: become the light. My body moved against my will as I was dragged upward, breaking through the surface into a realm where the lighthouse stood impossibly tall, its beacon now alive with a blinding, unnatural brilliance. I was inside it, part of it, my vision stretching across storm-tossed seas where doomed ships sailed toward their destruction, guided by the very light that consumed me. I screamed, but no sound escaped. My voice was now part of the hum, eternal and inescapable, echoing across the cliffs as a warning to those who dared approach. And as the centuries passed, I watched, trapped within the beacon, as others like me arrived, drawn by the same cursed pull, only to be swallowed whole, their faces joining the spectral glow that would forever haunt the shores of Hollowmore. The legend of Blackthorn Asylum always lingered like a shadow in the back of our town's collective memory. A sprawling, derelict building nestled deep in the overgrown woods, abandoned for over a century after the patients and staff mysteriously vanished one stormy night, leaving behind nothing but blood-stained walls and unanswered questions. I should have listened to the stories and stayed far away, but something in my gut, a mixture of defiance and foolishness, compelled me to go, armed only with a flashlight and a camcorder, desperate to uncover the truth. The hike through the forest was oppressive, each step muffled by a carpet of dead leaves, the dense canopy above swallowing the weak light of the moon, leaving the asylum's looming silhouette to emerge suddenly like a beast from the dark. Its windows were shattered eyes, its door a gaping maw that seemed to breathe, and as I crossed the threshold, a damp, rancid smell hit me, heavy with rot and decay, like a tomb left open too long. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and the silence wasn't really silence at all. It was alive with faint scuttling sounds, whispers so soft they could have been my imagination, and the distant echo of something metallic dragging along the floor. My flashlight beam danced over crumbling walls covered in mold and smeared with incomprehensible writing. Symbols that seemed to pulsate when I looked at them too long, names carved in jagged lines, some unfinished as if the writer had been interrupted. I ventured deeper, my footsteps hesitant, the faintest hum of a child's laughter, light, playful, and impossibly chilling, seeming to follow me down the hall. The asylum seemed to stretch unnaturally, corridors leading to more corridors, each turn revealing scenes of abandonment. Overturned wheelchairs, empty hospital beds with rusted restraints, and doors hanging off their hinges like broken limbs. A file room caught my eye, its contents scattered as if by a violent wind, but when I bent to pick up a file labeled Subject 0 for 17, Behavioral Deviance, the pages were blank, though the faint sound of someone breathing just behind me sent ice through my veins. I spun around, my flashlight catching nothing but a flicker of movement, something small, fast, and wrong vanishing into the next room. Against all sense, I followed, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears, and as I entered what looked like a therapy ward, the temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the flashlight's trembling beam. It landed on a mirror at the far end of the room, but instead of my reflection, I saw the distorted, flickering image of a patient, her face twisted in eternal agony, her mouth moving soundlessly as if she was screaming. The mirror shattered as my flashlight hit the floor, and then everything changed. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers grew into wailing screams, and shadows, no longer bound to the walls, crawled toward me. Their shapes humanoid but grotesquely wrong, jerking and convulsing as if pulled by unseen strings. Something wet and cold wrapped around my ankle, pulling me down, and when I hit the floor, I saw it. A face, pale and eyeless, grinning with a jagged mouth too wide for its head, its hand reaching out with fingers that were too long, its nails scraping my leg as I kicked and scrambled backward. My flashlight sputtered and died, and the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was that thing, standing upright now, impossibly tall, its head tilting unnaturally as if amused by my terror. I ran, blind, desperate, stumbling over debris and the bones of things I didn't want to think about, until I found the staircase to the basement, the only place the shadows didn't seem to follow, though the air down there felt wrong, thick and wet like the inside of a coffin. The basement wasn't empty. It was alive with movement, dozens of figures standing in the dark, their heads twitching and their mouths open, emitting no sound but exhaling that foul stench of decay. A light flickered ahead, a single bulb swaying above a metal door, and as I reached it, I realized there was nowhere else to go. The asylum had twisted itself behind me, the hallway gone, replaced with an unbroken wall of black, pulsing like it was breathing. My trembling hand pushed open the door, and inside was a room untouched by time. A child's playroom, pristine, filled with toys and painted murals of smiling faces on the walls. But at the center, a small girl sat with her back to me, her long black hair cascading down her pale gown, her head slowly turning as I stepped inside. When her face came into view, I froze. It was me, impossibly me, her wide, empty eyes locking onto mine as she whispered, "You've always been here." The room dissolved, the asylum swallowed me whole, and now I sit here, writing this with hands I can no longer feel, waiting for the next visitor to arrive, to hear my whispers, to take my place. It began with an old map I found in my grandfather's attic, a crumbling relic marked with cryptic symbols that led to the forgotten Blackridge Manor, buried deep in the woods where no path dared to tread. The stories of the manor's haunted history were whispered with fear. Rituals gone wrong, a family that vanished without a trace, and townsfolk who claimed they'd seen lights flickering in the windows long after the building had been declared abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, as it always did, and one moonless night, with a backpack of supplies and a flashlight I hoped wouldn't fail me, I set out on the overgrown trail that wound toward the cursed estate. The journey itself was unnerving. The forest seemed alive, shadows twisting and darting just beyond my vision, the crunch of leaves underfoot eerily muffled as though the very earth wanted to silence my approach. When the manor came into view, it was worse than I had imagined. A hulking, decrepit structure with shattered windows like blackened eyes, ivy clawing its way up the walls, and a massive front door hanging ajar as if inviting me in. The air grew colder as I stepped inside, the silence so oppressive it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, broken only by the occasional groan of the old wood as the house seemed to shift and breathe around me. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rooms frozen in time, dusty furniture, rotting portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and a grand piano in the parlor with keys yellowed and cracked, as though waiting for a ghostly tune. Something about the place was wrong. The walls seemed to lean inward, the shadows too thick, moving when I wasn't looking, and the faintest sound of whispering began to follow me, a hushed susurration that grew louder the deeper I went. In the dining room, The long table was set for a feast that never came, plates filled with rotted remnants, chairs tipped over as if the occupants had fled in terror, and in the mirror above the fireplace, my reflection lagged just a second behind my movements. A staircase wound upward like a skeletal spine, creaking under my weight as I ascended, compelled by a pull I couldn't explain, each step taking me closer to the source of the whispers that now sounded like voices, faint but insistent, calling my name. At the top of the stairs, I found a study lined with books that crumbled at the touch, a desk cluttered with notes scrawled in a language I couldn't decipher, and a single candle still burning, its wax fresh as if someone had been there moments before. A ledger caught my eye, its pages filled with names, dates, and a single word repeated in red ink, taken. The air grew heavier, the whispers now a chorus of anguish and anger, and when I turned to leave, I saw them. Shadowy figures lining the hallway, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, their eyes hollow pits glowing faintly red. My breath caught as I backed away, my flashlight flickering wildly, and then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl from below, vibrating through the floorboards. Something massive was moving in the house, something that didn't belong in this world, its steps shaking the manor as dust and debris rained from the ceiling. I ran, heart pounding, down a hall that seemed to stretch infinitely, doors slamming shut behind me as if the house itself was alive, guiding me toward its dark heart. I stumbled into a hidden door that yawned open like a mouth, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into the abyss. The air damp and foul, the walls slick with something that pulsed under my touch. My flashlight barely illuminated the passage, the stairs seemingly endless, the growling growing louder, accompanied now by screams. Terrified, echoing screams that made my blood run cold. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a cavernous chamber lit by an unnatural red glow emanating from a pit in the center, its depths writhing with shapes I couldn't comprehend, their forms shifting and melding like liquid nightmares. Around the pit stood figures, robed and hooded, their faces hidden, chanting in a guttural language that felt like it was clawing at my mind. And as their voices rose, the shadows in the pit began to take shape, something enormous and ancient rising, its presence suffocating, its many eyes opening and fixing on me. My scream caught in my throat as I turned to flee, but the hooded figures were already closing in, their hands cold and claw-like as they dragged me toward the pit, their chants growing deafening. I fought, but it was futile. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the darkness was the manor collapsing in on itself, swallowed by the earth as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the faint echo of whispers and the distant, haunting growl of something still hungry. The night I ventured into the hollow asylum, I thought I knew what I was getting into, just another abandoned place, another set of urban legends to disprove. But what I found there was beyond anything I could have prepared for. The building was a hulking mass of cracked stone, twisted iron gates, and windows darkened by decades of rot, perched on the edge of a cliff that overlooked a forest of dead trees, the wind howling through their brittle branches like a choir of tortured souls. I had read the stories, patients who had disappeared, strange experiments, doors that led nowhere. But those were just stories, right? I crossed the threshold, the rusted door squealing in protest, and the stale air hit me like a slap in the face. It was thick, suffocating, and tasted of something metallic, something that lingered in the back of your throat even after you breathed it out. I had my flashlight, but it flickered on and off in a maddening rhythm, casting brief, jagged shadows that seemed to dance on their own, like a twisted mockery of life. The hallway stretched in front of me, lined with peeling wallpaper and closed doors, all leading to rooms that seemed to watch me as I passed. The silence was oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break it. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no creaks of old wood settling. Just the feeling that something was always just out of sight, watching, waiting. I ventured deeper, my footfalls loud against the cracked tile floors, and as I passed an open door, I glimpsed a figure standing in the far corner of the room, hunched over, its back to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to gather the courage to move closer, but the figure didn't move. It was as if it was carved from the shadows, still and unmoving. I shook my head, telling myself it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games, and kept going. But something wasn't right. The building felt wrong. Every room was the same, faded, empty, save for the remnants of the past. Broken furniture, yellowed documents scattered on the floor, a cracked mirror hanging crooked on the wall. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt the presence of something that had never left, something that had been here long after the asylum was abandoned. The halls twisted, stretching farther than they should have, and every door I opened led to another set of corridors, all identical, all echoing the same eerie silence. I turned back, realizing I had lost my bearings, and that's when I heard it, the soft, wet sound of something dragging across the floor, coming from behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing, only the shadows, thick and heavy, pressing in from every angle. I quickened my pace, but the sound followed, growing louder, closer, until it was just behind me. I spun again, but there was still nothing, just the oppressive darkness that had swallowed the light of my flashlight. The walls seemed to close in, and my breath grew shallow, panic creeping in. I stumbled, my foot catching on something slick on the floor, and when I looked down, my flashlight revealed a long trail of blood, smeared across the tiles, leading down the hall toward a door at the far end, its knob turning slowly, as if beckoning me. I knew I should turn around, run, get out, but my feet moved of their own accord, drawn by the sound of the door creaking open. And then I saw it. Inside the room, illuminated by the faint beam of my flickering flashlight, was a chair, its seat covered in fresh blood, and strapped to it was a figure. A man, or at least what used to be a man. His eyes were wide, bulging from their sockets, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. The skin on his arms and legs was torn, revealing raw, bloody flesh, and his body was covered in strange, jagged scars, like something had been carved into him, symbols that twisted and writhed like living things. And behind him, in the far corner of the room, was the source of the dragging sound. A mass of shadows, its form undulating like liquid smoke, shifting and warping as it moved toward me. I froze, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs refused to obey. The shadow reached out, its tendrils extending like fingers, brushing against the walls, the air growing colder with each passing second. The figure in the chair twitched, and I saw the unmistakable glint of teeth, sharpened, jagged teeth, too many to count, as they snapped in the air like a hungry predator. A voice, no voices, whispered in my ear, 1,000 disembodied, tortured souls crying out in unison. And then the lights went out. The world around me was plunged into absolute darkness, the silence deafening, broken only by the sound of something breathing, heavy, ragged, in the very air around me. I spun, tried to run, but every direction felt the same, the hallways stretching endlessly, twisting around me like a living maze. And in the distance, I heard it again, the soft, dragging sound, growing louder, closer. The shadows were closing in. There was no way out. I was trapped, just another lost soul in the hollow asylum, another victim of its never-ending hunger. And just as I felt the first cold fingers of darkness touch my skin, everything went still. For a moment, I thought I was free, but then I realized the shadows weren't just around me. They were inside me now, feeding on my fear, swallowing me whole. I screamed, but no sound escaped. The hollow asylum had claimed me. The Ebonwood Sanatorium was a place I should never have stepped foot in. Yet there I was, standing at its rusted iron gates with nothing but my flashlight and the cold autumn wind that whispered through the skeletal trees. The townsfolk's warnings had been clear. That place is cursed. People who go there don't come back. And if they do, they're never the same. But curiosity has always been my downfall, and when I heard the stories of the sanatorium, the patients who vanished overnight, the staff found mutilated beyond recognition, and the inexplicable cries that still echoed through the forest, I couldn't resist. The building stood like a forgotten monolith, its crumbling facade consumed by vines, the broken windows gaping like empty sockets, and the heavy air carrying a scent of mildew and rot. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted, and an oppressive silence engulfed me, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep within the labyrinth of decayed hallways. My flashlight beam wavered as it illuminated peeling wallpaper, broken medical equipment, and graffiti scrawled in a frenzy that read, "It sees you, hears you, it never forgets." The shadows seemed to move just at the edges of my vision, and my own footsteps sounded foreign, as if they didn't belong to me but to someone, or something, following close behind. I tried to shake off the unease, venturing deeper into the asylum where the air grew thicker, heavier, almost sentient, clinging to my skin like a suffocating veil. Rooms yawned open like forgotten memories. A children's ward with rusted cribs and faded murals of smiling animals now warped into grotesque parodies. A cafeteria where overturned tables and scattered trays suggested a hurried flight, and an operating theater with rusty instruments lying in dried pools of something too dark to be blood. The faintest sound began to follow me, a dragging noise, like feet shuffling across the floor, and no matter how fast I moved, it always seemed to remain just out of sight. I came across patient files scattered in a nurse's station, the names scratched out but the diagnoses clear: hysteria, schizophrenia, unexplained manifestations. One photograph caught my eye, a young woman staring straight at the camera, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth frozen mid-scream. Before I could process the image, I heard it, the first sound beyond my own breath, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My name spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. My heart thundered as I stumbled into the next hallway, where the walls were covered in deep gouges as if something with claws had tried to tear its way out or in. The farther I went, the less the building resembled a hospital. The walls pulsed with an organic texture, the air reeked of decay, and a faint red glow seemed to emanate from cracks in the floor. At the end of the hall stood a door marked Ward X, its surface smeared with blackened handprints that trailed downward as if someone had been dragged through it. Against every instinct, I pushed the door open, revealing a room that defied logic. A cavernous space far larger than the building should allow, filled with rows of beds, each occupied by figures covered in white sheets. The sheets rose and fell as if the figures were breathing, but when I approached one and pulled back the fabric, the bed was empty, save for a deep impression in the mattress and a lingering warmth. Then the humming began, a low, vibrating sound that resonated in my bones, and one by one, the figures sat up, their faces obscured by the sheets, their heads tilting in unison toward me. My flashlight flickered, the beam catching glimpses of their forms. Hollow eyes, twisted limbs, mouths that opened impossibly wide, emitting no sound but exuding a palpable hunger. Panic gripped me as I backed away, only to find the door gone, replaced by a solid wall of pulsating flesh-like material that began to close in around me. The figures rose from their beds, their movements jerky, unnatural, their faces now visible, distorted versions of people I knew, their hollow eyes locking onto mine as they whispered in unison, "You came back to us." I turned to run, but the floor gave way beneath me, and I fell into a pit of darkness where hands, too many hands, reached out, clawing at my skin, pulling me deeper into the abyss. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the sanatorium above, its structure warping and folding in on itself like a living thing, and the faint, echoing wails of those trapped within, their cries blending with my own as I realized I was no longer leaving. I was becoming part of it. I had heard about the old orphanage for years, stories whispered through the streets of the town, warnings shared by those who dared not venture near it, but I never believed the tales. "It's just an old building," I told myself. What could be so frightening about a forgotten place? But deep down, I knew it was different. The orphanage, abandoned for decades, sat on the outskirts of town, its towering structure looming over the crumbling ruins of what had once been a thriving, if mysterious, institution. The gates had been rusted shut for as long as I could remember, the windows boarded up with planks of wood that had long since turned brittle, but I couldn't resist. I had to see it for myself. One night, under the cover of darkness, I snuck through the woods and approached the back entrance, where a gap in the fence provided an opening just big enough for me to slip through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was thick, oppressive, as if something in the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and made my way through the overgrown courtyard, my footsteps barely making a sound against the cracked stone pathway. The building itself was a mess of peeling paint and broken glass, the once pristine white walls now stained with the rot of years gone by. There was an old clock tower in the distance, its hands frozen in time, marking a moment long past. I could hear the wind howling through the cracked windows, and the sound of it gave the place an eerie, ghostly quality. As I approached the front door, the temperature dropped, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sending a jolt of fear through me. Inside, the air was colder, and the darkness seemed to cling to the walls like a living thing. My flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the room, and I could make out the shape of old wooden furniture, broken toys scattered across the floor, and faded photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. The silence was suffocating. I stepped further into the building, the floorboards groaning under my weight as I made my way through the empty halls. There was an overwhelming sense of abandonment, but also something else, something darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if eyes were watching me, unseen, lurking in the corners of the rooms, just out of reach of the light. I walked past what had once been the dining hall, the long wooden tables now covered in dust and debris. The faint scent of something rotting lingered in the air, but it wasn't just the building that stank. It was something else, something older, more decayed. It wasn't until I reached the stairwell that I realized the true depth of the horror that awaited me. The stairs were narrow and steep, the wood splintering underfoot as I ascended. As I climbed higher, I could hear strange noises, a faint whispering, like a distant chant, coming from somewhere above. My heart began to race, but I couldn't stop. I had come this far, and curiosity pushed me forward. The upper floor was darker than the first, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the thick gloom. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and something else I couldn't quite place. I moved from room to room, each one more unsettling than the last. The children's cribs were overturned, their blankets torn and shredded, and in every corner, I found old toys, dolls with cracked porcelain faces, stuffed animals missing their eyes, and wooden blocks scattered across the floor like remnants of a forgotten childhood. It was when I entered the last room at the end of the hall that I felt the change. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air became thick with something malevolent. I could feel it pressing down on me from all sides, suffocating me. My flashlight flickered once more, then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with the light, but it wouldn't turn back on. That's when I heard it, the sound of a soft lullaby, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, except for the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, slowly at first, then faster, the creaking sound growing louder, more urgent. I took a step back, my breath shallow, and that's when I saw it. A figure in the chair, draped in a tattered, yellowed blanket. Its head was lowered, its face hidden in the shadows, but I could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing. It wasn't until I took another step forward that I realized the chair was rocking back and forth on its own. And then, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, followed by a soft giggle, almost childlike, but laced with something darker, something twisted. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure in the chair slowly raised its head. What I saw made my stomach twist in horror. Its face was a grotesque, disfigured mask, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched too wide in a silent scream. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and as it looked at me, I felt an overwhelming wave of despair, like my very soul was being drawn into the emptiness of its gaze. Without thinking, I turned and ran, but the room seemed to stretch, the hallway twisting and warping as I tried to escape. The sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, followed me, echoing off the walls like the march of something ancient and relentless. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold, clammy hands of something unseen brushing against my skin, pulling me back toward the darkness. I stumbled, falling to the floor, but when I looked up, the figure was there, standing in front of me. The whispering grew louder, the giggle more distorted, as it reached down toward me, its fingers like claws, its skin cold as death itself. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare into its hollow eyes, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying outside, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The orphanage loomed in the distance, its windows dark and silent. I had no memory of how I had gotten out, no recollection of the journey back to the gates. But as I stood and looked at the building one last time, I knew one thing for certain. Some places, some memories should never be uncovered. The orphanage wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, and it had claimed me.